Okay, before we start really getting into turntablism, I need to talk to you about sort of the birth of hip hop and how all of this started, and why we have DJs and why we have hip hop. And so there's a lot of information to tell you, and I'm going to do the best I can to sort of give you as much information as I can. A lot of this stuff we could go on and on and on about it, but I want to set up the context for you. So we're talking about the birth of hip hop. And so there's a lot of things that we need to sort of understand about how we got where we are now. So I want to talk about where everything sort of began and what happened in the 1960s and in the 1970s. And I don't even know if you really understand what hip hop is. And hip hop itself is sort of has four elements of it. It has the graffiti writing sort of part of it. It has the MCing, which evolved off into like rapping. And it has the DJ part of it, and it also has the b-boy element of like breakdancing. So those four parts are of hip hop. Those are the four elements of hip hop that sort of came out of everything that was happening in the beginning in the 1960s. But what's the coolest thing about hip hop is this is completely a youth movement. These are high school kids that started hip hop. Everything sort of grew out of all the stuff that they were doing. And what's unbelievable that in the 1960s that these young kids have impacted something and created something that now is a worldwide phenomena in all of those things, in MCing, in b-boying, in DJing, in graffiti. It's worldwide. The industry, if you even wanted to talk about like even just with DJ and music and rappers and things like that, and it's $1 billion industry, if not more. And all of this started in the Bronx in New York. All these things that were happened in this like 7-mile radius for a number of years before it sort of exploded and made its way to other parts of the world. So in terms of when I think about my classes, urban art for social change, I mean, all of these things, maybe at the time they didn't really understand the impact that they would have on the whole entire world. But in terms of, people that were the age that you are now started these movements that, maybe at the time seemed insignificant, but have made such an impact. So to me, hip hop sort of represents urban art for social change completely in so many different ways. But I want to set up sort of the context about how this even began, or why this began, and all the different sort of some of the different elements that sort of added to why hip hop even started. So we're talking about the Bronx, where it was the birthplace of hip hop, and we're looking at some of the housing projects that a lot of African Americans were living in, and sort of like over the bridge, there's a lot of Puerto Rican immigrants that were experiencing the same thing. And we could talk at length about why the projects existed and all the circumstances that caused this. And there's a lot of politics and involved in this, but that's a whole other discussion. But what else was happening when these people were living in these housing projects? It's what sort of rose from that, where sort of gangs were being developed by a lot of the people that were living in the areas. And gangs, again, were something that were being developed in schools, in high schools, and it sort of like translated a little bit to some of the kids that, as they sort of in the 20s, but there was a lot of gangs violence. However, the hip hop movement really grew from the gang violence into something that became where a lot of these gangs end up being a lot of leaders and a lot of social justice reforms, and in a lot of different ways. So even though they were fighting amongst themselves in these different sort of gangs, a lot of these people ended up making some really powerful changes to their situation. And a lot of them were really brilliant leaders. So there's many, many things that sort of impacted sort of the birth of hip hop. And some of the things are the civil rights acts that were being signed. So there are a lot of things that are changing. And there were some ones before 1960, but in 1960, there was a Civil Rights Act that was talking about voting, and this act sort of enacted something that introduced penalties for anyone who obstructed someone else's attempt to vote, register to vote. So this is sort of the beginning of starting to have equality for all people sort of in America. Now in 1962, James Brown releases this, actually he did a live performance, I think at the Apollo, and one of his drummers introduced this sound, I think in one of his songs called The Funky Drummer, and it was this really cool like drumming beat. It was kind of like a solo for a drummer, and this ended up being called as a break beat, and we'll look more at that later, but that sort of really influenced like the breakdancing sort of whole genre and the b-boys, and this is what inspired sort of the b-boy movement. 1963 was that famous March on Washington where Dr. Martin Luther King delivered his I Have a Dream speech. And this was in response to violent attacks on nonviolent protesters in Birmingham, Alabama. So more than 250,000 people attended this March on Washington event and gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial. There were lots of musicians that performed as well. And this sort of event actually sort of rings true with what we're experiencing right now. In 1964, there was another signing of an additional Civil Rights Act, but this one is pretty important because it's ending segregation. And there was a lot of riots in a lot of the major cities. So in response to that, the Civil Rights Act was put into law, ending segregation in public places, and the banning of employment discrimination on the basis of like race and color, religion, sex, or national origin. In 1965, Malcolm X is assassinated, which had a huge impact, and this happened in New York City. He was an African-American nationalist and religious leader. In terms of the music and the technology that was happening in 1966, there's this invention of the cassette tape. I don't know if you've even ever seen one, but just having this invented and this introduced really gave way to these DJs to be able to start record their mixes, and then these cassette tapes could be easily reproduced and distributed, and that was part of what sort of took what was happening in the Bronx 7-mile radius area and actually spreading it outside of that. In 1966, the Black Panther Party is founded. This is founded by junior college students. It was founded in California. The organization was looking to expose all who exploited African Americans. And what they wanted to do was to lift African Americans out of poverty and different communities of color in the cities that there were Black Panther parties. In terms of graffiti in 1967, there's in Philadelphia, graffiti tags are starting to come up, and we'll talk a lot more about this in a graffiti tag unit, but Cornbread starts sort of the idea of putting graffiti tags everywhere. Later on in New York City, Tacky 183 starts to bring that to New York City. In New York City, the whole idea of graffiti sort of expands and explodes from just basic tags to more full color graffiti, and we're going to talk way more about that later. In 1968, there's assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King and also Robert Kennedy, the senator. In response to that, James Brown releases in 1968 an album, and one of his songs is I'm Black and I'm Proud. And the single, he was hoping to express his identity as a proud Black man, and also to give his fellow Americans something to take to heart and sing out loud. And I this song actually sort of I think it was one of the top Billboard hits, and I think it was actually played on white radio stations and sort of reached sort of that crowd. In 1968, some of these teen gangs that are forming, they're starting to, there's a lot of series of events that are happening. And one of the things is that they're starting to come together, and as they're starting to mature, because again, they're only teenagers, they're starting to come together and agree to stop fighting with each other and then start fighting with each other, and because they're not enemies with each other, and they're starting to look more into politics, and that's all being inspired with all the other things that were going on. And they start looking at their gangs. They're still gangs, but they organize themselves to fight against things like racism and bigotry and the spread of crime and drugs that they're experiencing in their neighborhoods. And their mission is starting to change. It doesn't mean that they're not always still territorial and fighting against each other, but their focus is starting to shift. In 1969, there's a huge Puerto Rican community, and the establishment of the Young Lords Party is established, and this is a Puerto Rican. This is done by Puerto Rican students, and they were inspired by the Black Panthers, and they're again something that were like started out as sort of street gangs, and they turn into these activists, and this is happening in Chicago, and they want to sort of gain social justice for the working class Latino populations that are largely Puerto Rican. And they're starting to try and focus on social justice reform. In terms of DJing, in 1969, there's a DJ, his name is Francis Grasso, and he starts developing this technique called beat matching when he's actually, what it is sort of the smooth transition of like playing with two turntables. Initially, when DJs sort of started, you got to remember that before sort of the turntable and records were invented or easily accessible, when you went to any sort of entertainment in terms of a club or something, or even on the radio, or for music to be played on the television that was there, it was all live bands. And so it were always live performances. The idea of going to a dance or something and having like records playing pre-recorded music was not an idea yet. So when the Nazis occupied Paris, France, during the Second World War, one of the things is they made it illegal to have live jazz bands played at their discotheques. And so what they started to do is have these underground sort of discotheques where they played, instead of live bands playing, they started playing these records. And that sort of gave way to the idea of the discos that we had in the United States in the 60s. So the idea of actually having records playing as pre-recorded music for entertainment is something that's really catching on. So in 1969, people like Grandmaster Flash and Afrika Bambaataa and Kool Herc and lots more are hosting these parties in their houses. They're going to the streets. They're plugging into, like, for electricity, like the lamp posts are getting electricity and having them in parks. And so the focus then is that these there's still gangs and things that sort of exist. However, these DJs are starting to host these really great parties in their communities, focused completely on music. The gangs are starting to come to there, but there's lots of gangs that are sort of coming together, and the focus now is sort of like everybody come together and celebrate and enjoy this music, and that sort of took away from some of the violence that was happening in the streets. James Brown is a huge influence on a lot of the music that was being played by a lot of these DJs, basically because of his style of dancing, which really influenced breakdancing, the movement of the legs and getting down, and but just the beats and everything. And in 1969, he has this he releases this album, and it's called The Good Foot, which inspires this dance called the Goodfoot, and it changes that sort of idea of the dance of the Goodfoot is later calling b-boying, and then it becomes breakdancing or breaking, and that's kind of what we have to see today. So a lot of that is because of James Brown's music and sort of the style that he's dancing in. B-boying is growing and growing, and in 1969 there's a formation of this Zulu Nation Kings, and they're primarily like a b-boy sort of dance crew. So what's happening now is that a lot of gangs are now evolving into crews. It doesn't mean that there still isn't rivalry but it's the competition is sort of changing. It's like the crews are now battling, but the battle is not violent anymore. The battle is starting to become like breakdancing b-boy battles and dancing battles. So you can see the transition to where it's like it's still competitive and it's still territorial, and they're gang-like, but they're becoming more crews, and crews are really huge in terms for b-boys. In 1970, DJ U-Roy had releases an album, and on the album it's actually focused on toasting, and he's a Jamaican born, and the idea of toasting is as sort of the predecessor to emceeing and then which evolved into rapping, and toasting is something that was happening on the streets in Jamaica, where the DJ was actually really was known as the MC. So somebody would be playing records in the background, and while you're switching records and there's some downtime, it's like the toasting would be sort of like filling in that time and over the microphone and giving shout outs and pumping the crowd out and making some of these small rhymes. So in 1970, this is actually released on an album, and then that sort of makes its way into the Bronx in New York, and inspires these DJs where they're now working. Normally the DJ would be the one sort of pumping and talking to people and pumping everyone up and saying things, but there's so much going on because now they have two turntables and they're mixing them and they're doing all this stuff that they're not able to talk on the mic as well. So they end up having these people that are called MCs, and these MCs are the people that start like that while the DJs are doing all this kind of stuff, the MCs are talking to the crowd and getting them pumped up. There's spoken word that's happening as well with a lot of in a lot of art communities, and that influences the style of like making rhymes on the spot, and that is where rap was actually born. In 1971, gang violence is still happening, even though a lot of them have evolved into crews. A lot of the DJs are still parts of gangs. It's kind of going back and forth. But in 1971, something sort of historical sort of happens, and it's something called the Whole Avenue Peace Meeting, and it's where a lot of the major gangs come together, and they actually come up with a peace treaty. Now, it all kind of came to a head where there was a lot of bloodshed between some of the gangs when one of the members of one of the gangs actually was trying to promote peace and was actually killed. So the response to that, they had a choice to either further the violence, and because it was starting to get out of control, but what they ended up deciding is they would come up with a peace treaty. And so again, everything sort of shifted from to violence to more to peace. In 1972, the idea of freestyle rapping is starting to evolve, and the MCs are more than just announcing, instead of just them announcing songs and filling in space, they're starting to really do a lot of rhymes, and they're sort of doing it on the spot. And one of the guys noted to actually start this his name is DJ Hollywood. In terms of graffiti, in 1973, a lot of these graffiti writers that have been working for a while, they start to get recognized, and they form a group called the United Graffiti Artists, and they actually form some sort of a collective. It's taking seriously. It's they're giving a space to actually work, and they're giving some funding. In 1973, one of the people that are credited with starting hip hop is DJ Kool Herc, and he forms Kool Herc and their Herculoids, and they start sort of, he's one of the ones that started hosting a lot of these parties, and he's credited with starting this, the idea of looping and the idea of taking just parts of a song and repeating them over and over again to extend sort of the breakdown and the beat. And he calls this technique the merry-go-round, and where you're just repeating, you're just looping something. Basically, he's got 2 records, and they have the same song, and he's just going from back and forth to the record in the same song, the same part, and repeating it over and over again. So that's when everybody sort of really gets down. This is when people start really, this is how like breakdancing actually sort of started. In 1973 also, there's this really cool guy, one of the founding DJs of hip hop. His name is Bambaataa. And so again, these are high school kids. He ends up being a really good writer, and he actually won an essay contest about something that he wrote, and he won a trip to Africa. And he got to go to Africa and see what was happening there. And interestingly, when he was there, he watched this video about something called Zulu Nation. And it was one of the first times that he actually saw something from an African perspective. In America, everything was like the white man was the hero. Like when you think about, I don't know, like see what he would have been watching on TV, like things like Tarzan. He's like the white man, the king of the jungle. But instead, he goes to Africa and he sees this Zulu nation that historically they were being attacked by the British, but they stood up to the British, and the story was told from the Zulu Nation perspective as opposed to the British perspective, which is something that Bambaataa hadn't seen before, and he couldn't believe seeing that in terms of the Zulu Nation sort of coming together and standing up for what they believe in and ultimately fighting the British. So he came back to the States and actually ended up calling himself Afrika Bambaataa. And he brought with him that idea of Zulu Nation. And he ended up getting a lot of followers for this. He ends up actually really focusing on Zulu Nation as sort of this organization, almost like a religion for peace. And they had a lot of followers and working together to sort of meet those ends. So the Zulu Nation is something that there's a lot of graffiti writers that were not only b-boys that were and in the graffiti scene, and there's so much, and we'll talk more about that too when we get into the graffiti. There's Grandmaster Flash that starts to come into the scene. He's sort of apprenticed by like DJ Kool Herc and Afrika Bambaataa, and he's taking all the things that these people have been discovering, and he's the one that really perfects it. Grandmaster Flash is really well known for like being on stage, like scratching with his elbows and spinning around and just really putting on a show when he does these things. So it makes, instead of having like the DJ sort of in the background playing the music, it becomes like a lot of a performance. In 1975, there's DJ Grand Wizard Theodore that also was working with these other DJs, and he actually invents the scratch, the Urik. And that's so common today that we hear sort of in DJ. There's a lot of things that I've left out, but that's sort of the gist of the progression and the context of how hip hop was really born. And there's lots more that we can talk about.